Good evening and welcome to Craft Beer Nation, Pints and Quarts. Today's Thursday, April 7th, and tonight we have Jason Perkins from Allagash Brewing Company. So make sure to pour some beer on that glass and stay tuned, and we'll be right back. All right, we're back, and tonight we're talking with Jason. Jason's the brewmaster of Allagash Brewing Company. How are you doing tonight, Jason?
I'm doing great. Thanks.
So you're just telling me tell me again, how long have you been with Allagash Brewing Company?
I've been there a little over 17 years, about 17 and a half years.
Wow, and how old is Allagash?
We'll be hitting 21 years in June, so not quite, but close to drinking age.
So we get to know you a little better. Tell us a little bit how was your journey into the craft beer? I mean, 17 years. That's man. That's you've been seeing a lot of changes in craft brewing on this few years. And so how did you get into your background? Were you a home brewer? How'd you get into your craft into craft beer and into starting with Allagash?
Yeah, I mean, my path is probably similar to a lot of brewers of my kind of generation in that I was a big home brewer. I was a home brewer through college, and then after I graduated from college, right afterwards, I was just really passionate about making beer at home, and kind of really fell into the industry in that I moved out of college out to Montana, actually, Missoula, Montana, a little town in Montana, western Montana. And I lived there for about a year. And during that time, I was buying all my homebrewing ingredients from a little tiny brewery called the Kettle House in that town. And they needed help. I was waiting tables at the time. It seemed a hell of a lot nicer to make beer for a living than to wait tables. So I gave it a shot, and I just kind of got hooked right away. And I worked for them for about a year, then moved back to Maine. I went to college in Maine, so I kind of came back this way, and just was hooked. I mean, I think from very early on my experience in a brewery, I kind of realized it was where I wanted to be, and was since then just kind of fortunate to get some good opportunities thrown my way. I worked for Gritty McDuff's, which is a brew pub, very small brew pub chain. They have 3 locations here in Maine. I worked for them for a little while, and then got my foot in the door working for Allagash when we were really, really small, and I've been there since. So, brewing for about 19 years professionally, but almost all that time has really been Allagash, and been really fortunate to grow the company as we've grown and learn from mistakes and learn as we go. Very much full-on apprentice style learning, I guess. Still learning to this day.
Well, it seems that you guys been stumbling in the right direction. I can tell you that. It's because you have a nice niche. Like your beers are very unique. You don't see a lot of brewers doing the stuff that you guys do there, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's maybe a little bit less true these days, but for certainly when we started in 1995 and for many years after, the beers we were making were very different and not something people were used to. Belgian style beers was not something the American consumer was familiar with, and the kind of ester profiles that are produced from yeast that are used in Belgian style brewing, and sometimes the use of spices or use of barrels and wild yeasts were very much a surprise to a lot of consumers. So we kind of had to fight that battle as we grew of educating people and letting them know really what was behind these beers. And luckily, times have changed, and consumers are a little more educated about the kind of styles that we've been passionate about for a long time. And because of that, we've been able to really grow even more. So it's been a fun ride to kind of see that transformation of people, what kind of beers people were interested in trying. And now, I remember 10 years ago, we would go to a brew fest, and I would spend a lot of time explaining to people what the styles were all about. And now, I start to explain a beer style, and it's very clear by looks in people's faces that they're pretty familiar with what I'm talking about. So it's been a nice change in that regard.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, tell us a little about an open vat and cool ship. A lot of a lot of our listening might not be very familiar with uh, the difference in those beers and the most beers that are brewed nowadays. Uh, just educate us a little bit on that style of beers that you guys are doing there. You just was telling me, did you say that you make three beers, three cool ship beers? Is that is that right?
Yeah, so the cool ship beers we make are really from a volume perspective a pretty small amount of what we do. It's a pretty small volume of what we do, but it's very much like a very important part of who we are as a company and what we're passionate about, what our employees are psyched about, what our consumers are psyched hearing about. And it's a very unique process for making these beers, these cool ship beers. And so, basically what it is it's modeled after lambic production. So lambic beers are made really very traditional style brewing that is very centralized to greater Brussels area in Belgium. And beers have been made for a long time. And we kind of were curious if we could produce spontaneously fermented beers in the same kind of form in Maine. Because, started this project in 2007. The kind of conventional wisdom was that you could only make spontaneously fermented beers or naturally fermented beers in the greater Brussels area because there was kind of some magical yeast that were present in that area, and we kind of were curious and wanted to kind of challenge that premise. And so we started a project where we kind of modeled the brewing process after lambic style brewing. The big difference being we're cooling the wort in Portland, Maine instead of Brussels, Belgium. It's been a really fun project. I mean, initially we started as a full-on experimental project where we didn't really know where things would go, and now it's kind of slowly formed into something that we can actually be really proud of and something we can sell a limited amount of. These beers are still only available in our tasting room and our retail store only because it's pretty small volumes, but it's been a pretty exciting project and been a lot of fun to kind of see how it went over the years.
Yeah, they're excellent beers because it's a style that I'm fond of, and I have it all of Jester King and even some Anchor Brewing that does some stuff. But Allagash beers are far known, one of the top beers on the styles for that particular styles. And so, how big is your production right now? How big is the brewery doing a year?
Yeah, we'll probably end up this year somewhere around 90,000 barrels.
Okay.
So it's certainly been a pretty steep growth curve for us. I've seen us from when we were really small to now, but it still feels like a very manageable number, and it feels like it still feels small to me, and I still feel really connected to the beer and the employees. So it's been exciting for sure. We can't complain. We feel very fortunate to be able to have grown the way we have. So yeah, it's good. I can't complain. Life is good.
Wow, that number is not too shabby. That's a pretty good number. So yeah, so do you guys have a beer that's kind of your flagship, something that you the one beer that you rely on that you produce all the time?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, our flagship is Allagash White. Our Belgian style wit beer. It's the first beer that we started with, that Rob Todd, the founder of the company, started with in 1995. It was really our only beer for the first couple of years, and it still remains a huge part. It's about 80% of what we make, and it is, it's interesting to look back on when we first were making that beer and the challenges that we had. I referred to a little bit earlier with Belgian style yeast and spices and cloudiness in beer. The beer, it is intentionally and very controlled level of haze in the beer. It's very much a part of the style. But 10 years ago or more, that was a big challenge trying to explain to people what that was. And Allagash White was very much a kind of innovative and new style at the time, because there weren't really many wheat beers in general, let alone Belgian style wheat beers in the U.S. at that time. And fast forward to now, where that style is a little bit more well known, and because of our fortunate success, we're in certain markets we sell a lot of that beer, and it's just been interesting to see how that's changed from a beer that you really had to educate people on to a beer now that is, it wouldn't by any means say it's commonplace, but it's a beer you see in a lot more places than when we used to. So, but yeah, Allagash White's absolutely our flagship. Probably always will be. Belgian style wheat beer, modeled after that real traditional style that's been around a very long time, with some raw wheat, some malted red wheat, coriander and orange peel, Belgian yeast strain. Complex yet very drinkable beer. That's one of the things we really love about that style.
It's not only a delicious beer to drink, but it's awesome to cook with. It's such a complex beer that I know I made a risotto with Allagash White that is out of this world. I love it. Now you guys do a tripel that is really good as well.
Yes, we sure do. That was one of our other first early beers. I think we started that officially a couple years into the brewery, so sometime around 97, 98. It's actually one of my personal favorites. It's probably, if anything, the beer I drink the most of at home. I think it's a great demonstration of what Belgian style yeast strain can do for a beer, because it's really a very, very simple recipe. It's one malt. It's our base malt, plus some sugar, some granulated sugar, some 100% sucrose that really helps to dry out the beer, and some hops, but it's mostly Hallertau and Tettnang hops, noble hop varieties on the lighter side, and really the big complexity of the beer, the complexity and flavor and aroma profile comes from the yeast itself. So I always like to talk about that beer in a very simple recipe, yet really complex flavor profile and aroma profile. You get a lot of kind of tropical fruit character and some honey notes and notes that you would think wouldn't be achievable just with a yeast strain, but very complex aroma profile, very, very dry, drinkable. Very, very versatile food beer. One of my personal favorites.
So Jason, I don't know can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay, so apparently my camera is not going to work tonight, but nonetheless, I wanted to ask you about. Okay, so you spoke about Allagash White being your flagship beer, and here in Virginia, one of your beers that seems to be well, obviously it's not always available, but it's Allagash Curio, and it's definitely one of your more popular beers. Is there anything you can say about that particular beer that, as it relates to your portfolio and its popularity, and maybe speak towards how it wasn't intended to be your most popular beer, but it ended up being that way?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's a fun story. It's a great story. Another beer that I'm a huge fan of, and if my wife was standing beside me, she would say it's her favorite beer. So by nature, I end up drinking one of that at home. But it's a beer that kind of came from experimentation and came from playing around, and we do a lot of that, I should say, and do a lot of barrel aging of various types. But this is one that I wouldn't say it necessarily came about by accident, but it came about a little bit by surprise. And so what basically happened about 11 years ago now, something like that, 2004, around that, so maybe even 12 years ago, we were experimenting with aging in beer in barrels on a very, very small scale, and we got some bourbon barrels in from Jim Beam, and we're kind of playing around with what beers could potentially work in that format. And at that time, we only had a handful of beers even available in our portfolio, and we aged several of our beers in single bourbon barrels. And I think the few of us at the brewery at that time, none of us would have thought that triple, so it's our triple, which I just spoke about, aged in a bourbon barrel, and none of us would have thought that particular mix would necessarily work. I mean, triple is a very simple beer ingredient-wise. In some ways, you could say delicate in some capacity. Bourbon character and oak character is pretty aggressive. So we didn't necessarily think it would work, but we tried it nonetheless. And when we emptied that barrel for the first time, we were just blown away by kind of the way that those flavors integrated together. And as a brewer, you like to think you have a good idea about how flavors are going to integrate together when you're planning a beer and planning a recipe. But sometimes you just don't necessarily know. And this was something that just worked remarkably well together. And it started on a really small scale. We're like, wow, we kind of got something here, and continued to increase the amount we made. But literally, like from one barrel to a couple months later to a couple barrels, and I'm talking a oak barrel. And then it just kind of got this kind of momentum behind it, where people really were intrigued by it. I think it's a very unique beer in that you capture the flavor of a barrel and capture the flavor of spirit in the bourbon, but yet it still can be approachable for people because it's not. A lot of times barrel-aged beers and bourbon-aged beers are very strong in both alcohol and in flavor profile. So maybe a big stout or a lot of really heavier flavors, and so I think it ended up appealing to people for being something that was still capturing all the flavors of oak and bourbon, but still being very approachable. And it's just continued to grow and grow and grow, and it's still growing as we speak. And there's some challenges with making it grow in that we can only source so many barrels and only make so much. But I can't believe the amount of people who want to drink that beer at this point from such a small beginning.
I don't think I ever taste any beer like. I think it's very unique. I can't recall any beer that tastes anything like the career.
Oh, for sure. And Gil, to your point, it's absolutely unique. I mean, because you got, for example, you take into account you got breweries like Jester King, and you got breweries like Blue Jacket here in Washington D.C. where they do have a cruise ship program. I'm sure there are others out there who have a cruise ship program, but going back a little bit earlier to talking about having a cruise ship program, I mean, there's got to be a little bit of fear there because you're not able to necessarily produce a consistent product because you're kind of at the whim of Mother Nature. So, I mean, is that something that you guys take into account, or do you just kind of charge it to just being just that and the whim of Mother Nature? This beer may be one product this year, but we feel like we have enough of a following to where next year this beer may be a little bit different, but we think our folks or our fans or our followers are still going to be able to appreciate the joy of spontaneous fermentation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to ask that. It's a really good question, and I could probably talk for hours on. But
we're here for it, man. Let's geek out, man. Let's straight take it to beer nerddom, man. You know what I'm saying? Let's do it.
Sounds good. So yeah, I mean, as a brewer who's by nature, a lot of times our focus is to be consistent and to produce this consistent. Most of the time, we're really looking. Yes, we're looking for unique flavors and pushing, adding creative beers. But in the end, what we want to produce is we want the consumer to get the same beer again and again. Like that's what. If I was a consumer, I want every time I buy it. So that's kind of our focus. And so when you start working with these beers, whether it's coolship on the extreme or even some of the just general barrel-aged beers, you start to push up on that concept, and you start to push up on, more like a vintage of a wine to some degree. But, in terms of coolship beers specifically, I guess the way I like to look at it is, we still do everything we can to control what we can control. And it's just a different mindset when we're making those beers. We can't as much as we can when we're producing Allagash White, for example, but we can still control what we can control. So, for example, with our cool ship program, we at this point have a very tight window for weather. So when we brew a cool ship batch, have a very tight temperature window for when we'll brew it. And if we look at the weather the day before and it looks like the weather is going to go outside of what we were expecting and be either warmer or colder in the overnight, we'll cancel the brew. We won't do it because we've learned from experience that that's a factor that can influence the variability of the beer. We are very careful with the barrels we use, for example. We make sure that the barrels are sourced from a good place, and we make sure that they're clean and neutral barrels. We control the barrel room itself, temperature-wise, so there's no ups and downs of a season, or years where it's warmer or colder. Our barrel room stays the same temperature throughout, and all of that can only control so much. And so our final kind of control piece, if you will, is the blending piece. Is that when we get ready to make a batch of Cool Ship or sorghum, we're kind of do what we can to select the right barrels that work together well and produce a beer that is going to be more like what we expect from it. That being still, even though we've been doing this since 2007, it's still such a new learning curve, and we learn every year with what that beer should be and learning experiences go.
I'm surprised.
So all that being said, go ahead.
I'm surprised that the pricing point is so good for that beer. I mean, the amount of time and real estate, because storing barrel, people may not be aware of this, but it takes real estate, time, and money, and your prices are fairly reasonable for that beer.
Yeah, I think you're right. Joked around at the brewery that we don't really want to actually look too closely at what the cost is, because we might not like what we see. Because it's hard from an accountant perspective to really put a number on, like you referenced, the time, the storage, the space. It gets a little harder to put a number on what that actually costs us, but it's certainly substantial. We're very fortunate to, have some success that's allowed us to do this project. We're exceedingly fortunate to have, we're still, an independently owned brewery with just one owner, with Rob Todd being the owner, and he's super into these beers. So, it enables us to continue to do it, because if you looked at it from a strictly cost perspective, if we had a banker come in and look at that project, they'd shut it down in no time, because there's no way the numbers would necessarily add up. But it's a super fun project for us, and it's a big part, like I said earlier, of who we are as a company.
Yeah. So all your beers use Belgian yeast strain, or you use other strains of yeast as well?
Yeah, I would say, for the most part, almost across the board, every beer we make would be, labeled as a Belgian style yeast strain. The only real occasional exception is if we're doing, occasionally with some of the sour and wild beer that we're working on, we'll start with a more neutral yeast strain, so say like an American ale yeast strain, and then maybe finish it with a blend of lactic acid bacteria. So that's maybe an exception, because in the end it's still very much Belgian influenced. But yes, across the board we're using almost exclusively Belgian type yeast strains.
So Jason, let me ask you this. I know here in DC we have I don't want to say we have a guy, right? But Greg Engbert, he's here at the neighborhood restaurant group, and
Sure.
he has so Greg, right?
I know Greg. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Greg has an obvious affinity, and I'm gonna give a shout out to DC. We lost tonight, but that's okay. We lost to the Marlins, but that's okay. Anyway, Greg has an obvious affinity toward Belgian styles, right? And they just opened up a second brewery that's dedicated specifically to Belgian styles, and a lot of which are styles, or not styles, but breweries that a lot of people may not have experienced or heard of or whatever, but it's dedicated toward Belgian beers. Um, what what is your approach when it comes to people like Greg, where they want to, um, for lack of a better expression, Allagash and Omegang for that measure are the extent that the American craft beer public get exposed to Belgian styles of beer, or even Belgian styles of yeast, right? At least in a good measure. So, what is your approach when it comes to people like Greg who want to kind of produce styles that kind of highlight what Belgium has to offer in the American palate, for lack of a better expression?
Yeah, I mean, I guess not knowing exactly what Greg's going for. I mean, I have a ton of respect for Greg. I think he's done phenomenal stuff with the places he's opened. But I mean, I think Belgian style brewing is like, it's such a nice. We love following that kind of inspiration
Hmm.
because it's such an open canvas. It's it's not as clear as making, as much as I love traditional German style beers. I really do when they're really well made. Some of my favorite styles in the world. They're really regimented.
Hmm.
The guidelines around them are really set, and that's some to some degree what makes them great, but it's also what makes them limiting. And one of the great things about Belgian style or Belgian inspired beers is that there's not really a scaffold around them. I
Hmm.
mean, people always ask me, how do you define it? And we can work to define it in terms of yeast inspired or yeast driven, but in reality, it's really the wide open kind of innovative canvas that makes it what it is. And there's whether American craft brewers call themselves Belgian style brewers or not, there's a lot of them who have influence from that tradition of outside the style box brewing,
Right. There's,
if
there's
you
a
know what I
lot of
mean.
there's a lot of room for
So
play, right?
exactly, and whether it's barrels or yeast or spices or anything, just creating a new style. I mean, if you travel around some of the traditional breweries in Belgium, even the ones that have been around for a long time, style is not something. Beer styles are not necessarily something
Hmm.
that they adhere to. There are certainly traditional styles like Belgian triples and whites and doubles, but there's
Hmm.
also a whole bunch of breweries who just have their beer. It's their beer. It's the beer they make, and that's kind of it. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
Oh no, you're good.
it's a wide open canvas.
Yeah, and the fact that it's a wide open canvas means that I don't think that you could give a wide open specific answer, because I mean, if you look at guys, as I mentioned earlier, you look at Omegang. I mean, they brew great beers, and you guys absolutely brew awesome beers, right? So the even from the perspective of, if your malt bill is the same, right? If you have a malt bill and you send the same malt bill to Omegang, you guys are both going to produce a very distinct Belgian beer, because in a lot of cases the difference comes down to the yeast, and
Agreed.
Belgian yeast,
Yeah.
and compared to American styles, I think that the Belgian yeast imparts so much more flavor than you're gonna get, from a typical American brewery. So, I wouldn't expect that you guys are able to give a canned answer. I like the fact that, and I'm getting a little invested here, right? I like the fact that you can't give a canned answer, because there's so much differentiation that exists, because it exists simply because of the style, right? I mean, you're at the whim of Mother Nature. You're at the whim of literally how the wind blows, right? So I like that, and I praise you guys for doing what you do, because you don't necessarily subscribe to a particular thing, but you subscribe to a ballpark, for lack of a better expression. I like that. I think Gil was about to say something. Gil, what's up?
No, I was just saying I agree, and I think there's a lot of new taking. Like I mean, your Saison Black is such another beer that has such a unique flavor. Uh, I think that's one of the things that we always talk about Allagash is some of your unique flavors that you have something on your own that it's something beyond even Belgian style beers.
Agreed.
So is that something you do consciously? You try to innovate into that same group of styles, or just it all happens organically?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely there's a ton of organic creation at Allagash, which is, I think, part of who we are. But yet, in terms of how new beers are created, they can kind of come from anybody in the company, and we have a lot of venues to tap into that kind of passion and knowledge. But in the end, they all kind of do have to kind of follow loosely what defines Allagash, and a lot of times it is a very yeast-driven flavor profile. So whether it's our white, which uses one type of yeast, or our saison, which uses another, and even our black, which uses another yeast strain, we really work with a lot of different yeast strains, but all of them produce ester profiles and flavor profiles that are oftentimes the driving force behind the beer. And that's kind of often what we talk about, is that our beers are, for lack of a better way to say it, are yeast-driven beers.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a lot of American craft beer these days, whether it's hoppy pales or IPAs, are very much hop-driven, which I certainly love those beers and drink plenty of them myself. But in those cases, the yeast strain selection and the yeast strain, the contribution of flavor that the yeast provides is kind of a background. It's important, the yeast strain and what you select, but it's not the driving kind of character flavor profile. Whereas in our beers, it kind of is. So we end up spending a fair bit of time and money in selecting strains and controlling strains and using them. We end up spending a lot more money on yeast and time on yeast than a normal brewery would, because that's kind of our signature.
Yeah.
So
go ahead, Gil.
I was just saying, so you basically almost 20 years into that industry. How much change have you seen? What are the main things that you've seen happen? Because it's not many people that we talk that has been doing this professionally as long as you've done.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, before you answer that, Jason, I want
Sure.
to say this. Gil and I are both home brewers, right? And from a homebrew perspective, we focus a lot on malt and on hops. And here you are, not just you, but Allagash as a whole. Yeast plays a big part in your game, and in the resulting flavor profile. So I want to throw that in on the end of Gil's question, right? Like, how do you take that? I mean, I just ordered the the Brooks says water, yeast, malt, and hops, right? I ordered the yeast book, and it arrives today. I haven't even had a chance to open the package yet, but I know that means something to you guys, because you recognize what it does or what it contributes to the art of craft brewing. So I just want to kind of juxtapose that or bump that against Gil's question before you answer it.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I guess, I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, like, yeast is just so much a part of what we do, and, it's not that we disregard what hops and malt give to us by any means, just like, a great IPA brewery is not going to disregard what yeast does for them, but we just really are looking to get a good chunk of our flavor and aroma profile from a yeast selection. Where if you're making more hop-driven beers, you can use the same yeast strain and use a whole variety of this. I'm kind of simplifying things to some degree, but if you're a hop-driven brewery, you can use the same yeast strain and a whole range of hops and techniques of dry hopping and late hopping and variety changes and so on, and produce a wide range of beers. You can also do more what we do, which is we do play around with hops for sure. We play around with malts. We have to. But we do a lot more tinkering in the yeast range. That's just kind of what we do. And so in any given year, the average craft brewery might use a couple yeast strains in a given year. In a given year, we're probably using 15 to 20 different yeast strains in various beers, just because that's a big part of kind of what we do. In regards to kind of Gil's question around growth and what I've seen, and it's really been a really fun ride to see, specific to Allagash, and I kind of referenced this a little bit earlier, in the first really 10 years that I worked for Allagash, I loved every minute of it, but it was a challenge every time we did an event, every time, we went to a brew fest, there was this kind of burden of education and, people looking at a beer that was cloudy or spicy or ester driven and just being like, something's wrong with this beer, or this beer is infected. And, it's been interesting to see that really completely shift around to the point where, in some cases, a beer that was so unique and shocking for people is a beer that people are very, very familiar with now, Allagash White. But the one thing I often talk about with the industry changes, and it all ties together, is consumers are so educated now, and it's fantastic. I mean, I remember doing events 10, 15 years ago, and a question would come from an audience or whatever, and it would just be the most rudimentary question, and it was fine, it was still enjoyable, and I'd have to cater the answer to those individuals. And if I were to ever talk about a yeast or even a hop variety or anything that is somewhat simple in the brewing world, I'd have to gauge the look on the face, like, is it a blank stare? Do they have an understanding what it is? And most of the time it was a blank stare. Now I can start talking about Brettanomyces and lactobacillus bacteria, and there's no glaze. It's just like, tell me more. I want to know more. So that's been the biggest change for me, which is, of course, why we're growing, why all breweries are healthy and growing, is because the consumers are so engaged now. And because of that, I think brewers have to really bring their A game, because you just can't put a crappy beer out there anymore, because the consumers are going to move on to the next beer next to it that's not crappy.
Right. I gotta tell you, man. I every year I go to there's a brewery down in Charleston, South Carolina called Brewvival, and
Festival.
a festival. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's not a festival. It's not a brewery. It's a festival, and you probably know about Brewvival. But one of the things about Brewvival is that the folks that brew there, they don't just like Allagash isn't just gonna bring Allagash White and be done with it, right? You're gonna kind of bring your A game a little bit, or at least bring some type of a one-off, because that people who are attending that particular festival, they know a little bit about craft beer. And one of the things that I've always been impressed with is that, even though you got Curio out there, you got your Allagash Black, you got your Allagash White, you got your kind of, your staple beers, the people who come to that festival, they know that they're gonna go to the Allagash line, because they know that Allagash does it a certain way, right? Allagash isn't just gonna kind of, it's not just about the white, it's not just about the black. It's about putting out great beers. It's about putting out a great experience for the people. It's about making sure they experience something that they haven't necessarily experienced before in their everyday craft beer, you know, regime, right? So they get to experience something different. And that's one of the things I like about you guys. You know, you guys bring a unique perspective to brewing to the American craft beer public, which, as you just admitted, is becoming every day a little more educated, a little more, you know, even if you got people who aren't necessarily, you know, they aren't particular to the Belgian style of beers, uh, they respect the fact that Allagash is bringing a different perspective to styles that they are familiar with.
Well, and
So
educated customers are willing to spend more dollars too.
for
It
sure, for
helps, right?
sure, yeah.
Because I think there's an understanding how much goes and how with the cost of brewing beer, So at least that's how it worked for me. Nowadays I understand why a beer costs $20 a bottle
Hmm.
sometimes, or even much more than that I'm willing to pay because I know what goes into a beer, and that's I definitely that goes for Jason's comment. Really changed the whole craft beer view and industry. So Jason, do you guys have anything coming out? Any new releases or any beers that you're on the back of your head that you guys are
Yeah, I mean,
that you don't have to kill us if
we
you tell us?
Right.
yeah,
Don't
no, no,
kill
no,
us
not
at
at
after
all.
party.
I can definitely tell you. I mean, we have, we basically always have something new that's in the works. That's kind of what's fun about Allagash in this industry right now. So we've got a bunch of small scale stuff coming out, but we've also got a couple new beers coming out in bottles really soon that I'm super fired up about. Because sometimes with our new beer kind of projects, a lot of times it's really small scale experimental stuff that we may only sell at the brewery only, which is certainly super exciting, but not something that everybody can get a handle of. So we've got two beers coming out in the month of May that we're pretty fired up about. Two pretty different beers. One is a beer we're calling 16 Counties. It's actually what I'm drinking right now. So it's Allagash 16 Counties, and 16 Counties name is in reference to the 16 counties in the state of Maine. Um, and it's something we've been working on for quite a while. We've got all the grains sourced from the state of Maine. So there's malted barley, both grown and malted here in Maine. We've got oats grown and processed in Maine, and then unmalted wheat, which is grown and then cleaned here in Maine. So 100% Maine-grown grains. We're fired up because 3 years ago, 2 years ago even, you couldn't do this in Maine because there just weren't, despite tremendous agriculture available in Maine, you couldn't get brewing specific ingredients here. So it's a project that we've been working on, and now year round we'll be selling in 750 milliliter cork bottles. And the beer is fantastic, and it also allows us to let these very new farmers who are working on growing barley, malt barley, growing wheat and oats to continue to kind of grow their
So that sounds like
crops.
a tribute because you have a series of the tributes that normally we don't get it around here. Is that what it is?
Yeah, this is not part of the tributes specifically, because the tribute series is something we've been doing for a long time, where it's a once-a-year release. This will be a year-round beer.
Okay.
It'll be available throughout the year, and there will be some opportunity for us to give back in monetarily to Maine agriculture with this beer, but equally as important is just our agreement with these farmers to purchase what they're growing and what they're malting, because that's the only way they're going to be able to grow that business in the state of Maine. So, but I shouldn't discount the fact that, or shy away from the fact that we're super proud of the beer itself. I mean, I think the kind of unique characters of the Maine-grown grains kind of get a chance to shine their way through. We ferment it with our normal Belgian-style house yeast strain, so it's a nice Allagash character to the beer in and of itself. And so we'll be shipping that in about 2 weeks across the country, so it'll be available nationwide.
So I don't know if you've met me, but my name is Randy, aka Jealous. Um, and aka Jealous, aka Hopeful that that we'll get that here in Virginia.
You absolutely will.
All right, so fingers crossed. I'm gonna be on the lookout, man, for sure. Um, do you guys have any festivals that you're gonna be pouring at here recently? Well, not recent, but upcoming. I know Gil, Freddie, and myself are gonna be at Savor coming up, and I don't think you guys are pouring at Savor, but is there any
We
chance?
actually are pouring in
Yeah,
Oh, you
Savor.
are.
exactly.
Look at
That's
that.
that's the reason we're having them on today. Yeah.
Perfection right there. Um, can,
Are
can
you
you
gonna be there?
can
Are
you
you gonna be there yourself?
I will be there. Yeah, I will be there for
uh
sure. I love that. I love that event. I think it's very well done. Nice combination of food and beer. We actually are doing the collaboration beer this year too with Deschutes.
that is
Deschutes Brewery
right.
out
What
of
am I
Oregon.
thinking?
So
What's
we just actually brewed it last week. We just had the Deschutes folks at our brewery last week and had a blast. Such awesome people and
So which style
um,
of beer are you guys brewing for the Savor this year?
the simple definition we're calling it is a sparkling pale, which we just made up that style. It's not a real style, but
it happened?
um, the idea is that Deschutes is a brewery very well known for their pale ale and for their kind of somewhat English style beers. Uh, Oregon malt, Oregon hop influenced beers, and we're known for, as I've already said, for Belgian influenced beers, bottle conditioning.
Petty
So what we
Grove.
decided to do is kind of try to combine those. So we're doing a very simple malt bill for the beer. Actually, 50-50 blend of a Maine grown and malted barley, which I just referenced for the other beer, and then the other 50% is a Oregon grown and malted barley. Um, Dry hopped and dry hopped with some Oregon hops, Crystal and Cascade, hops of kind of which have heritage through um, Oregon in their history, and then bottle condition. It'll all be bottled only, pretty high carbonation. So that's kind of where the sparkling piece comes through. So fermented with a saison yeast strain. The idea being, don't get it too complex. Let the malt and the yeast strain get a chance to show their thing. So should be fun. Should be a fun beer.
Pettigrove's Chance is what the beer is going to be called, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And
So
that name comes from um, basically when Oregon was settled and they were looking to name the city of Portland. Apparently, they did a coin flip between two individuals to decide what to name the city. And Pettygrove won the coin toss and got to name it Portland. Apparently, if the other guy had won, I forget his
Is that the
name,
name of the city by a
it
coin
would have been
toss?
called Boston. So, so that's our connection. Portland, Maine, Portland, Oregon. Even though Deschutes is actually technically in Bend, Oregon, it's still our connection to Oregon and Maine.
so can we expect a collaboration between Allagash and Trillium at some point in the future? I mean, just to keep the Portland Boston thing going, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't
You guys
rule
should
it
call
out.
it
I
the
mean,
Fatal
Trillium's
Four
making some
Seasons.
fantastic beer, so
For
I wouldn't rule it
sure.
out.
Hey, JC, I don't know if you're watching, but we'd love to have you guys brew beer. I guess whatever.
Awesome. Anything else? Anything else you wanna let our listen be aware of before we move on to the after party?
I don't think so. No, I mean, no, no. Thank you very much for having me.
But
Jason? Yeah. Go ahead, Vin.
I just want to say, I thank you guys for a lot of I think a lot of the American craft beer public, they're used to specifically the American style of craft beer, and their exposure is limited to American style yeast strains or something along those lines. And I really do appreciate the fact that you guys kind of bring a different perspective to craft beer, right? Um, I like the fact that you guys allow, and a lot of your styles, you allow the yeast to shine as opposed to just allowing the hop to shine or allowing the malt to shine, or you guys either bring you kind of complete the circle, or you just allow the yeast to shine, which is a necessary and viable and important component to craft brewing. It's not just about malt. It's not just about hops, but yeast play a role, and we need to know that, and people need to learn to appreciate that. And I like the fact that Allagash makes that a forefront issue, or you get it. You get what I'm trying to say.
Of
Yeast is
course, yeah.
it's an important component to beer, and I love the fact that you guys highlight that. And yeah, so I love it. Cheers to you guys. Keep
Yeah.
doing it, man.
Cheers. Cheers.
Well, I wanna thank Randy and Jason for tonight. This was a very exciting hangout for me. Allagash is one of the reasons I love craft beer, and
For sure.
I didn't want to sound like a fanboy, but Jason is one of my idols. I love the style that Allagash do. So that was awesome. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Randy. And for all listening, have a great end of National Beer Day. And hope to see you guys again next week. And
Cheers to that.
yeah, and don't forget to mind your P's and Q's.